The information expressed in the following podcast is intended for educational purposes only and was created by and belongs solely to Believe Limited and the Flow podcast and does not necessarily reflect the views of our sponsors. Please speak to your healthcare provider before making any medical decisions.
Hi, I'm Jessica. Welcome to Flow. I'm here with Sarah Watson, sex therapist. And this month we have Dr. Bannow flowing with us. We're going to talk about research studies and bleeding disorders and menstruation and so much more. But before we go, we want to know, how's your flow? Welcome once again to Flow. We start off Flow every episode with a question to normalize the reality of menstruation. So we're going to ask and answer to our assembled flowsters. How you flowing? How's your flow? Where are you at in your cycle?
So I think I'm close to, maybe ovulating. But I just don't, I'm just coming off a nasty sinus infection. So, but that's life.
Heard. I'm curious. I'm in my PMS. I'm in luteal PMS, and I almost get like a pre-period sick sometimes. Like my immunity is just like a little dampened right before. I noticed that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe that's what it was. Could be the bachelorette party I had this past weekend too.
Oh, maybe.
Yeah, just saying.
Jury's out.
Yeah. Dr. Bannow, how about you?
So I'm actually a better living through chemistry kind of girl. I suppress my periods with my birth control, which I love. But if I had to guess, I would think I'd probably be in the follicular phase.
Interesting. And follow-up question, do you feel any other hormonal shifts during your cycle? Not having the bleed, but can you tell when you're ovulating and that sort of thing?
Well, I shouldn't be ovulating if it's doing its job. I use the Nexplanon, the progesterone. But you know what? I have about 1 day of miserable PMS, and that's pretty much it, which is a major benefit. Because it used to be a lot more than that, to be honest. So there's a few changes, but they're definitely dampened. And like I said, it's better living through chemistry in my book.
Agreed. High five to
Absolutely. We have the technology, we have the science, and we like to use it. We're going to talk about that and a lot more, but first we're going to hear from our sponsor.
This ad is brought to you by Von Vendy, Von Willebrand Factor Recombinant.
Hi, my name is Nicole. I didn't always feel empowered to speak up for myself or ask for the care and support I needed. Becoming part of a community and hearing other people's experiences helped to change my perspective. That's why my deciding factor is making my voice heard. To hear my story and access other helpful resources, drop by Von Vendy, that's VonVendi.com/patient-stories.
And we're back. We're going to talk to Dr. Bannow. We're glad to have you back on Float. We're going to talk about your line of work, which could you just let us know what you've been doing since we last spoke to you? What is your focus these days?
Yeah, sure. So my focus is really understanding how the uterus stops bleeding, which if you think about it, right, we have an organ that bleeds every 28 days for 40 years and it doesn't scar and it stops bleeding. And how amazing is that? And how cool would it be if we could understand that for the whole body at large, right? If we could, take better advantage of this, what I think is kind of a miracle. And so my kind of laboratory research right now is really understanding, like I said, how we stop bleeding and specifically why some people have heavier periods than others when we've already ruled out things like fibroids and they're ovulating normally and all those things, because that's the majority of patients I see. So that's my kind of lab research. We've delved a little bit into just, we poured some blood on pads and tampons and the internet broke. It got so excited about it. It made me so happy that we were getting to talk about periods. And I've been doing a lot of kind of education and advocacy around women's health in hematology, which I really love. And so really delighted to get a chance to be on your powerful advocacy tool here in the Flow podcast.
Well, absolutely. You're like a VIP. You're studying the very thing we ask about all the time. Why is it so heavy? And what can we do? What can we do? I mean, in advocacy, sometimes it's about getting on social media and getting annoying. That's what we can do. But from your line of work, you're really getting into the nitty-gritty of why things are working the way they are.
Yeah. Oh. Yeah. There's so much to learn. And, we just keep fighting the good fight. and trying to get more information.
Yeah. So before we dive into that, can we ask you, what was your first period like?
Oh goodness. Well, I was 13. I remember that. And it was a little bit later than a lot of my friends, and my school had done education so far as that goes. And, fortunately my parents, weren't too self-conscious about talking about periods, at least in the home. And so I was pretty well prepared for it. It wasn't too big of a shocker for me, and it was actually pretty easy. My periods were never that bad when I was a teenager, so can't complain.
Great.
Amazing. So then was the inspiration to study why they can be so bad for others?
Well, a lot of my patients have very bad periods. In fact, I am sometimes amazed that anybody has normal periods based on the folks that I talk to in my clinic, right?
Sure.
But interestingly enough, so I, again, an ode to better living through chemistry. When I was an intern, so a baby doctor right out of medical school, I was on birth control to suppress my periods, and I wound up getting a blood clot in my lungs, probably as a result of that medication, which led me to kind of a whole interesting diving. And it's actually what got me into hematology. I was a very bad patient, and my residency director kind of connected me with this wonderful woman by the name of Tracy Minicello, who's a doctor in the San Francisco VA who specializes in thrombosis. And I think, his intent was for her to kind of like mom me, so I would take my meds and stuff like that. But really, I just was so fascinated by the work she did in her clinic. And that's kind of how I got my start into thrombosis and hemostasis, and progressing on through kind of the different stages of my education. I got really fascinated by, the balance between the risk of bleeding and clotting. And where I did my my fellowship, we had a lot of patients undergoing stem cell transplant. And so that was kind of like where I got my first taste of that. Turns out, I don't know if you guys know this, but women are 50% of the population. So there's actually, I know, right?
Wow.
Amazing. I mean, you couldn't tell from the research and things like that, but it's actually true. And so it was just way more fun and way more accessible to study the balance between bleeding and clotting in women who are having bleeding events every 28 days. Pregnancy increases our risk of blood clots and, of course, our risk of bleeding. And so it's really just scientifically fascinating to me. And then, of course, I've built this clinic over the years that really focuses exclusively on folks who menstruate or can become pregnant. And it's just such a great population to take care of. And it's so rewarding because, a lot of times people come and they've been suffering for years and years and they didn't know it could be better. And we're able to make things better. And how great is that? So that was kind of a long answer to your question, but it's been a path to get me here.
I'm just still amazed that it's 50% of the population, because if you look at the research
it's
studies and the leadership we
crazy.
have, it seems like much less.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like we're like 4% maybe is what it kind of feels like.
Yeah. I think that's actually probably the actual number of medical school deans who are female. So
Oh God.
maybe it's a little better now. That might be an older number, but yeah, it's an issue.
And so I'm sort of wanting to cut to the chase of this reality that there's 50% of the population are women, and yet they haven't been in the research studies. And that's been a trending topic to some who are paying attention, noticing that we haven't even been included, which is why it might be hard to get these diagnoses. But why? Why is that?
Goodness. How many hours do we have? Maybe a week?
Sure.
I'll try to make it as short as possible. So, I think, one date that I kind of like to point people back to is 1977. And that was when the FDA, in, the kind of the years following the thalidomide problems, with people were using thalidomide in pregnancy, and then we were seeing a lot of babies with limb abnormalities, right? Decided in its infinite wisdom at the time that we should just exclude all people who could possibly be pregnant from our studies, because then we would eliminate the risk of causing birth defects, right? And that has been recognized to be not a good idea. And the NIH actually now requires people who are NIH funded, research studies that are funded by the NIH have to include both sexes unless there's a good reason not to, right? If you're studying prostate cancer, you don't have to include women. If you're studying periods, you don't have to include, folks who are assigned male at birth. But in general, you have to have both and report on both, which is a big change. But it's not necessarily, we're not necessarily catching up as quickly as one would hope, in part because, a lot of the big studies out there of new medications are really funded by the pharmaceutical industry and not the NIH. And so they're not bound by those requirements. And I think people, they get so focused on like, what could the risk to the baby be? Almost like women are just gestational carriers and not actual humans. I said it. I don't regret it. That we kind of miss the forest for the trees, right? And so I think that's a big barrier to research. And, this became like really powerful for me. I think actually the last time I was on the podcast, I was pregnant with my second child. Her name's Abby. She's an absolute delight. And when it came time, it was kind of fall of 2022. She was born in early 2023. And I was thinking about like, okay, I got to get my flu vaccine, got to get my COVID vaccine. And I was talking to my OB. There's never a question about if I was going to get it or not. It was a question like, when's the best time to get it, right? Should I get it early on? Because we knew that like ICU outcomes in pregnant people with COVID was really bad. Should I get it later so she has more of those antibodies circulating? And my OB was like, well, we don't know because pregnant women weren't allowed in any of these studies. And that just blew my mind, right? Because, at the time of her birth, right, the minute they cut that cord, I was considered competent to consent for any and every treatment she might need. But while she was in my body, basically somebody had decided that I couldn't provide informed consent. And so I think it really comes down to this concept of informed consent and trusting women to make the best informed choices for themselves and their babies, right? It's it's a problem that we can't quite just kind of get over that hump of being like, yeah, but you can make the decision after birth, so why can't you make the decision before birth? So I think that's another challenge. And if we look at the literature, so with the exception of like, bacteria, every cell has a sex. So if we are culturing human cell lines, right, those come from somebody who has two X chromosomes or an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. And so they all have a sex, but they don't report the sexes of cells when they do studies in the vast majority of time. So even when it's as simple as just a cell in a petri dish that can't possibly become pregnant, we're still not great about recording it. And then if you get into the animal studies, right, there's been this kind of misnomer that, oh, well, female mice, they have more variation than male mice. So then you're going to have to do more of them and it's going to be more expensive and we can't possibly do that research. So we're just going to do the research on the male mice. And so it's, multi-causal to say the least, right? There's a lot of points within the research process at which kind of women get the short end of the stick.
And that breakdown was so precise. And I want to follow up to ask your opinion, if I may, because you pointed out that, is it the NIH or NIH rules?
The NIH requires people to include men.
But pharmaceutical research, where a lot of it's happening, does not. And so in the spirit of change is possible, who would we need to talk to inform at any of these places doing these studies that are not cleared by the NIH that it would behoove them for their patient base to be including in the study? That it's a rule. Yeah. How would that happen?
I think that's a great question. And I think there's kind of a variety of ways to go about it. One approach that I've tried to take is, journals that publish these data can hold their feet to the fire a little bit. There's a set of guidelines called the SAGER guidelines that were developed over a decade ago that say, hey, you should disaggregate your data by sex and report it because this matters. And a lot of journals say they want people to follow them, but don't actually require it. So that's one avenue. I think also, really ultimately it comes down to the FDA, right? Because at the end of the day, pharmaceutical companies are companies, they have shareholders, they have bottom lines that they're thinking about, and nothing you or I say is going to change that. But if they want to get ultimately they have to get their drug approved, right? You can't get your drug prescribed, you can't get paid for it if you don't get your drug approved. So if the FDA were to start requiring some of this data, I think that's actually where the money would be in terms of like actually making things happen. But the FDA does not answer to me.
No, okay.
Or anybody that seems like right now it's a wild, wild west.
Yeah.
Is very much. And, in the Wild West, I recently learned that men did outnumber women about 3-1 in America, at least in the, colonial project. But I think that the reason it's so wild means there's opportunity to establish a new way of doing things that's part of the future. At least that's my hope. And so the idea of reaching out to the FDA is one solution. I'm curious, as these are my follow-up questions, how would we address if you have the solution, you win $1 million. How do we address the bodily autonomy conversation high enough up that the trickle down, high enough up though, right? Obviously it's a one-on-one, much like the FDA, that women have the informed consent. Who would need to prove that? Not that we should have to, but since we seem to, who would be the one to say, look, women, we have proof?
I mean, I wish I knew. I really do. Right. That's the $1 million question. There were some interesting things, articles that came out kind of after the Dobbs decision. And I remember reading a very lovely article by a couple of my friends out of Ireland talking about how Ireland, abortion is legal in Ireland, despite that historically being a very, religiously driven culture. And that was a lovely discussion. But I mean, I don't even know how to get people to understand the difference between right and wrong these days, let alone bodily autonomy. It's
same.
Yeah, it's a struggle.
I love that question, Jess. I really do. But in this time, what I mean, I think we were just talking about advocacy for any type of rights, right? So
it's much bigger, I guess. And this is, I don't know if we'll include this, but I recently watched The Rehearsal. It's on HBO, Nathan Fielden's show, and he did this research study of data marking conversations between pilots and co-pilots to notice that often a co-pilot had mentioned and there was an issue, but the pilot said, nah, it's not a big deal. And that's when the plane would go down. So my point would be, is there some way to say, hey, a woman advocated, we have tracks, she advocated for the thing she actually needed. And because the doctor said no, and then here, if we have all those results together, I don't know how we would gather such. And this is just a hypothetical brainstorming session now, but yeah.
I mean, I think we're hearing those stories anecdotally again in the post-Dobbs world, right? We're, it's not, I don't know that it's necessarily, there's been big research studies on it, but you can, Google it and find like 1 million kind of individual stories of women who had really bad outcomes or just very narrowly escaped really bad outcomes because of Dobbs, and the medical implications for a pregnant person. So, the stories are out there. You got to be committed to listening to them, though, and that's the crux, right? How do we? I think it's more. It's not even like, can we get the data? It's, can we get people to believe the data and act on the data, right? I think that's the bigger challenge.
That makes me want to cry.
Yeah, sorry, that went dark.
No, we are straight talk.
No, this is our reality. Like, that's why we have to talk about these things, right? People aren't alone.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost like taking a moment of silence for the fact of the fight to be believed in what your reality is. A lot of time what we're collecting stories here on Flow is of some of those realities, but of the advocacy of what it means and what can happen when uninformed menstruator brings that data and research to the table.
Yeah.
Right.
Grounding us back in bleeding disorders in the community that is affected by such. In the community, if you have hemophilia, for example, the bleeds that you might encounter are tracked, but menstruation is not necessarily tracked as part of that data. Is that a problem, in your opinion? Is it that, the bigger question is, should period be considered a bleed for that data tracking? Should it be? Can it be? Ought it be? We're just asking for a perspective.
That is such a great question. And so My answer is a little bit complex. So I would say, first of all, absolutely, it should be tracked, and it can be tracked. There are ways to do it, and there's no question in my mind, particularly considering that heavy periods are how many women present to get a diagnosis of a bleeding disorder. And I would say, even in those who get a diagnosis of a bleeding disorder for other reasons, there's often a history of heavy periods that just hasn't been acted upon. Now, in terms of whether or not we say yes, a bleed, no, not a bleed, I would say it needs to be its own category, right? It is neither a bleed nor not a bleed. When we think about the physiology of menses, right, and kind of the way we're taught it in medical school, which I think is a little oversimplified, right? The idea is that you have this building tissue in the endometrium, you have these special spiral arteries getting nice blood to that tissue, so it's ready for a fertilized egg should that happen, that cycle. And if there's not a fertilized egg, the progesterone drops, the blood vessels kind of just shrink down, and then the tissue dies and is sloughed off. And in theory, there really shouldn't be much, if any, blood, right? Those vessels should be closing off, and it should just be that tissue. So it shouldn't be a bleed, but in many cases it is, right? Those vessels are not closing off the way they're supposed to. Certainly in patients with bleeding disorders, we maybe understand why that would happen a little bit more. My research is really trying to figure out why does that not happen in some individuals without systemic bleeding disorders? But regardless of whether, it's a bleed or not, the heaviness is important, and the impact of quality of life is important. And so I think that we should be tracking these, and we should be looking at outcomes. And what's fascinating to me is that, the power, in studies, when we talk about power, of course, we mean, how many patients do you need to show that there's a significant difference between treatment A and treatment B? And for a lot of studies, that's like thousands of patients, right? Having somebody who has an event, whether we call it a bleeding event or not, every month that you can track over time, there's so much rich data there that you wouldn't actually need as many patients, right? It should actually make things easier. But it requires, that we agree upon a method. And, I think just using any method is more important than which method you use. But, there's diaries that we can use. We can technically collect period products and calculate how much blood is in them. That's expensive, and it's a big ask of patients. There's quality of life questionnaires that we can use. So there's lots of ways to do it. You just kind of need to settle on which way you're going to track it. And make sure that we're including females in these studies, right? So people assigned female at birth are we're not eligible, for example, for any of the gene therapy trials for hemophilia. And, the easy, reason that they can give is oh, well, we're only studying people with severe hemophilia, and that's usually men, but there are occasionally women with severe hemophilia.
We've heard from them. Yeah.
I'm related to them.
Yeah.
Yes, I know.
Yeah. And they would have been excluded from the studies anyway because they only enrolled male patients. And so, we got to get the women in there. We got to get, agree upon some of these methods for tracking periods, and agree that it's a really important metric to be following. I think we just kind of oh, women have periods every month, it's normal, let's not talk about it, it's kind of gross, which I've practiced medicine in the VA. The amount of conversation I have had about bowel movements that nobody thinks is gross is just, I could fill books of it. And yet somehow periods are gross. I don't make the rules. But, I think those are some of the things that we need to be thinking about to try to capture this very, very important symptom more effectively.
It is a vital sign, absolutely, to be tracking it is normal.
Yes.
I wonder if it also goes back to medical school and how you are taught about menstruation and bleeding. And I'm curious, what I have been told is that there is very little about hemophilia in medical school, let alone I'm curious, if you're doing your gynecology, rotation, how much are you really understanding and getting about menstruation?
That is such a great question. Both points. So first of all, yeah, there is very little. Even in my fellowship, which I went to a fellowship that had an affiliated program, excellent hemophilia treatment center. But I would have only spent basically a couple of afternoons there if I hadn't intentionally sought out that myself. So, and many fellowships don't have an affiliation with an HTC.
Right.
So it's very easy to get all the way through fellowship without learning very much at all about bleeding disorders. And in gynecology, and I would say again, my medical school had a phenomenal gynecology program, and I work with many of these gynecologists to this day. I still, I don't think that I came out of that, third year rotation really knowing what a normal period was. I don't recall that ever coming up. That was something that I kind of had to gather from the literature myself later. And certainly plenty of my colleagues, they do this and they think about it and they talk about it all the time. It just kind of didn't make its way into that third year rotation. But you can get out of medical school knowing very, very little about menstruation and bleeding disorders. It's, it's concerning.
Because I also think about it too, like I talk to my clients about, I get on my soapbox when we talk about menstruation and sex and all of that.
Yeah.
And it's, we talk, okay, I had this conversation yesterday. Okay, where are we going to go? Who are we going to talk to about what's going on? Well, I like my primary care, so we're going to start there. But I'm assuming, right, primary care is even less information, right? Because you're still getting that maybe a day or two, maybe, in gynecology. Like, how does that... So again, it's like going back to medical schools and saying, hey, this is really important.
Yeah. Yeah. I will say, it depends a little bit on your primary care. So I did my training in internal medicine and I learned nothing about periods in that training. I think my family practice colleagues learn a lot more about menstruation because they're dealing with menarche. And then some people would consider they're gynecologists, but I'm not even sure every gynecologist out there knows what a normal period is. I don't know that that's, especially if they're particularly OB focused or procedure focused, or they went to school a long time ago and the data, wasn't really there. It is, and certainly let alone the lay public, again, 50% of whom are having periods, right? We're not even getting that information in schools. Shouldn't everybody have access to that information? Like you shouldn't have to go to medical school to know this information. So, I think there's so many places that we could be doing better. Let's put a positive spin on it. Lots of opportunity for improvement.
Okay. So we're reaching out to medical schools and the FDA.
That's my list too. Yeah, cool.
Got it? Yeah. Okay, cool. Okay, great. Got it.
Could we go back to both a specific scientific question, if you will, from how you were describing the vessels, that would lead into what you yourself are currently studying? As you put it, you're studying why in a normal operating uterus function, those vessels close off at the time they do versus with extreme bleeds where they do not, and the blood continues to flow. Is that a fair enough? Maybe that's a layman way to say it.
That's pretty darn close, actually. Yeah.
Well, and so what is how are you studying it, if you'd engage with us on that in detail, and what are you finding?
Yeah. So we are collecting menstrual blood, which it took me about 5 years to convince anybody that women would do that. And they 100% do. So we just have folks wear a menstrual cup overnight and bring it in. And then we just treat the menstrual blood like we treat venous blood. Shocker. I know. But basically, we do the same thing as happens when you kind of go in and have your blood drawn. And we're looking right now at 3 specific kind of coagulation or anticoagulation things. So one of which is TPA, which is that's the clot busting drug. If you've ever heard of somebody, they have a stroke, they go in, they get the clot busting drug. That's TPA. So it breaks down clots, right? And we know that TPA is very active in the uterus, which makes sense, the menstruating uterus, because if all the blood just turns into one big clot, it's not going to pass through that teeny tiny, hole in the cervix. And so it's very active there. And so we're looking at differences in that between people with versus without heavy menstrual bleeding. And we're looking at a couple of other chemicals that interact with clotting. And then we're also doing endometrial biopsies, taking a little tiny piece of tissue from the luteal phase. And we are working on culturing the endothelial cells, which are the cells that line the blood vessels, and treating them with different estrogen and progesterone to see if we can measure kind of what clotting factors they produce, or specifically the messenger RNA for those clotting factors. So the kind of the precursor to the factors themselves. And those are the things that we're looking at. And it's just the very beginning. Those are 3 things that we focused on because there was some pre-existing literature about it, but there is a multitude of factors that we could be looking at, thinking about. I have a mentee who's looking at, trying to look at expression of factor 8 in the uterus and menstrual blood of hemophilia carriers. Wouldn't that be interesting? Because if you have one gene that functions normally and one gene that doesn't make factor 8 quite right, maybe one is overexpressed in the endometrium. We don't know. So yeah, things like that, which is it's really fun. And my study coordinator is amazing, and she loves being on the study because the women who come in to give samples, she's like, they're so fun. I love chatting with them. They're so excited about science. They want to hear the results. It's really been a lovely, lovely journey.
It's incredible. I mean, how excited. I'm genuinely
amazing.
enthusiastic.
Yeah, I was thinking, my eyes were like, that's so exciting.
It's so fun. Yeah.
How are menstruators signing up? Can I ask? How are you finding your participants?
Yeah, so we had been doing the recruitment at OHSU in Portland, Oregon, and so people were able to sign up through the website. We're actually on hold right now because I'm switching institutions, hoping to reopen that at Oregon and then also get it opened in Cleveland at the Cleveland Clinic. So not recruiting right at the moment, but hopefully up and running again in a month or 2 once we get the funding sorted out.
And I will just add here, so maybe by the time this episode comes out, we might be closer too.
Yes.
If we may, in case that's the case, where would people find out more
Yes.
about that if they wanted to get involved, if they're in the area?
That is
Or
a
we
good
don't-
question. I will have to send you that information later because, haven't quite got there yet.
Absolutely.
Oh,
We'll follow
it's
up.
so
for that.
exciting.
Yeah, thrilling. I've learned so much just by hearing what you already know. You are clearly a leader in the academic space that you're in.
Yes.
And I guess I'm curious then how, just to make it personal, how knowing all this implicates how you show up to other menstruators in your life who maybe don't even know what the normal cycle is. Do you ever feel that difference of being so informed and seeing that a lot of our 50% doesn't have the same access to info? Yeah.
I do. Yeah. And well, I'll start with, I have 2 daughters, right? And there's this fantastic book called 1 in a Million that was written by a science teacher. It talks about ovaries and periods and things like that. And it's aged for as young as 4 years old. And you better believe we have that book. And we started reading it when my daughter was 4 years old. So we talk about menstruation in this house. We talk about menstruation at the dinner table. We talk about it all the time. My favorite thing is I wind up talking to a lot of Uber drivers about periods, even though they're often men, right? Because they'll be taking me to the airport and they'll be like, "Oh, is this business or pleasure?" Yeah. I'm like, "Oh, I'm gonna, go give a talk at the scientific conference." "Oh, what's the talk on?" "Well, let me tell you, it's about periods." So kind of try to get that information out there to everyone, because everyone should know about it, not just women, right? We all know menstruators, whether or not we are menstruators. And it's definitely something that, I try to talk about with my friends. Like I want to be careful and not do the like, "Oh, I'm a doctor, you should tell me all your medical stuff." We kind of try to keep that firewall there, but also very eager to share, whatever information might be helpful to them. So, I just talk about it as loud and as often as I can, and in the hopes that, it's not going to change the world, but it might change things for a few women. And that's what more can you ask?
Yeah, I believe in the domino effect. I think that's foundational to why we're gathered here today for certain. We hope listeners are taking it as a permission slip to learn more, to get activated, and to maybe follow up. Maybe we don't have the answers of how to get in touch with the FDA, but maybe a listener does, and we're in it together.
Yeah. Yep.
Is there a way that listeners could access the work you're doing, information about it, or what you've done to date to find your
Yeah, they could probably just Google my name and find a few things that I've written. We got some of our work out in the lay press when we did that study, looking at how much menstrual blood different products were able to hold, and so some of that is freely available. We do have a website for Dr. Period Hackers, drperiodhackers.com. It's in its early stages, but we have posted a lot of the work that we've done there, and so folks can go there and learn a bit about it there as well.
Of course, and we will include that in our show notes. It is interesting. Some people don't want to answer how's your flow, or don't necessarily want to talk about their own period if they have one. We've found that as well. Do you have any recommendations for how people could think about their period not as an inconvenience, but as part of their health, and how it could be,
How do we change the narrative?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I love what you said about periods are a vital sign. I think thinking of it in that way is very helpful. It makes it very fact-based, right? And I think a lot of the bad rap is when you do hear periods talked about in the lay press, it's like talking about PMS or like, oh, it's that time of the month and, things like that. And so I think kind of thinking about it as a bodily function that can provide helpful information rather than this kind of shame or I don't know who decided that periods had some like moral implication, because they absolutely don't, but we treat it as if it's like immoral in some way, right? Just really thinking about it clinically. And, I mean, people who I work with probably wouldn't be real thrilled to hear me talking about my own period, but you know what? It happens. It's part of life. It's part of our bodies. And if we expect our patients to be honest with us about this, we have to be honest about it ourselves, right? We can't have that double standard there. And so I think it's really important for that reason to make sure that we are not buying into that shame culture and that stigma culture, that we're standing in clear opposition to it.
Round of applause to that, as we like to add in our things.
For sure.
How about, so you are about to open up the new Cleveland space, and when this airs, that might be happening. I'm curious, looking into the future, do you have some sort of hope for 5 years from now in your study?
Yeah, that is a great question. So, I mean, I hope that 5 years from now, we will have gotten some information from the studies that we're doing now that might lead us to either new treatments or maybe a change in the way that we use the existing treatments, right? Like, one thing that I've wondered about is like, should we start tranexamic acid earlier? Should we start that before the period starts? Would that change things? And I think anecdotal data says that for some people it does, or might, but how we identify those people, that's what remains unanswered. So I hope is that in 5 years, we'll be doing trials to actually, change period outcomes and improve them. So that's the goal. That's the dream. That's what it's all about. But you got to start at the beginning, but begin with the end in mind.
And that's what we're here to support. I mean, that is truly so invigorating to understand you're doing this work. Truly, what can those around you do to help you? What would support you in the work you're doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think just talking about periods more, honestly, is going to be helpful, right? The more we talk about it, the more we normalize it, the more, if people in the FDA are starting to hear about periods in their everyday life, then maybe they'll be thinking, oh yeah, hey, with this study of this blood thinner, maybe we should be thinking about tracking data on periods, right? I think that's something everybody can do. Everybody can just kind of talk about it more. I'm NIH funded, and the NIH, we don't know what's going to happen in the next period of time, right? So let your representatives know how you feel about research and women's health and the NIH. I would say that's an important thing to do. And then just be nice to each other.
What?
Can I say that?
Yes, you can say that, of course. Of course.
Wait, I'm not going to say, can we all just get along? Because there are some people that I am never going to see eye to eye with. But, I think the more we try to make the world just a kinder place, the better for everyone, right? And the more we'll see each other with compassion, and the more likely we are to think about things that affect our fellow human being, like heavy periods, things can look kind of dark. And so, keeping that hope alive, I think, is something that we all can do.
You're an inspiration to us there. Thank you.
You guys inspire me. This is great. You have a whole podcast talking about periods. I love it.
Yeah, it's so much fun. We love it too.
Very much. I think my hormones just changed as we were talking. Do you ever feel that? I mean, I know you're on different systems. I am not on any chemical, any birth control. And sometimes I literally can feel things so sensitively. Whoo. Mm-hmm. I feel like a rush of that luteal, was that the progesterone dropping? I can feel it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what happens at the end, like right before menses start. Yeah, the progesterone plunges, and that's where, when the symptoms can be kicking in.
Which reminds me, one follow-up question on your study: the hormones' interaction with clotting, with the TPA. Is that part of it? Like when you mentioned what happens when estrogen is added to the TPA?
Oh, so we are adding estrogen and progestin to the cultures of cells. So we're taking cells from the endometrium and growing out specifically the cells that line the blood vessels, because those are the cells that make TPA and things like that. And we very much expect that how much TPA and PI1 and TFPI, those are the chemicals that we're looking at, how much the cells produce of those is going to be tied into the chemical changes, right? Because we don't think that the body is creating that much TPA all the time, but around the time of menses, maybe it's going to increase. And so how does the body know to do that other than those fluctuations in hormones, right? That's how the vessels know to shrink down. That's how the lining knows to build up. Like, it's all driven by hormones. And so that's why we think the behavior of these endothelial cells is likely going to change with different hormone exposures.
Incredible. Yeah. And this is, I feel like a dumb student, but
So
suggesting that maybe estrogen additions would increase clotting.
So we know, for example, that birth control pills in pregnancy, right, increase the risk of blood clotting in the greater system, right? And we know, for example, factor 7, increased exposure to estrogen increases factor 7 and a lot of other of these chemicals. So yes, absolutely. At a systemic level, we know that estrogen has an impact on those clotting hormones, or those clotting proteins and chemicals, but we don't know at the uterus level, right? At the endometrial level where the action is happening, we don't know that so much.
But then
It's still so cool. And the fact that I love that you're doing all of this, but then I'm always like, how do we not know about this yet?
I know. Can you imagine if men had an organ that bled and healed scarlessly every 28 days? I feel like we'd know a lot more about it.
The rule would be that we would be ruled by vulvas and uteruses.
Yeah, it would be seen as this is this miraculous organism thing that we would see and try to honor and figure out how to replicate the actions of, versus to answer that one question, when did it get seen as immoral? I know there's some great ideas in the general philosophy, but I think somewhere in Christianity they say that it's bad that women bleed, and that is a lot of, unfortunately, impacting our clinical realities. That religious text is impacting our clinical realities.
So I have to say, full disclosure, my husband is a pastor.
Yes.
I do consider myself to be a Christian. My favorite Bible story is about a woman who had a period and it didn't end. She was bleeding for years and she touched the hem of Christ's garment and she was healed. There is a story about Jesus treating heavy periods in the Bible. No excuse.
And that's where we have to end. That is the best ending of this. What else can you say?
Jesus cares about heavy periods, people. Get the word out.
Periods. That's going to be my next t-shirt.
Okay. Yeah, you just changed the game.
Let me know when you make it. I'll buy a dozen.
Okay. No problem.
Yeah.
We're going to do that.
Yeah, we might need to campaign on that. I mean, how has that been missing from the discourse for so long? Bless you knowing that. Thank you for sharing it.
Maybe because the discourse is led by people who don't have uteruses.
Well, do we need to get the population to be like 75% uteruses just to rebalance things out? Would that help?
Maybe.
I don't know.
I think we just need to get the other 50% to care. And Even, and it's not exclusive to men, right? Women can be very dismissive of other women's experiences as well, which is sad but true.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, since you've shared what you've shared, I have full hype woman mode activated. Yes. We're like, sorry,
boom,
Sarah.
boom. Yeah. No, I love it. We're going to hype it. I love it. And I feel like this was an amazing lesson for us today. I learned so much in the little short time we've been talking to you. So thank you for that. I appreciate it so much.
Yeah.
Just thank you for having me, and just everybody talk about periods. It's totally okay. It's totally normal. It's something you can do today.
Well, that is certainly what we hope to encourage here on this show, that it is just as simple as asking each other, how is your flow? So we'll keep asking, we'll keep sharing. Check the show notes here for links to everything we've been talking about. Flow is produced by Bloodstream Media. Big shout out to our creative director, Amy Board, and our editor, Kay Vermeil. New episodes of Flow will be available the second Thursday of every month.
Hey, that's the day after I start menstruating.
And thanks to our sponsor, Takeda, for their support of Flow.